This video summary is for lesson 7 in our study in Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 14, 8 through 15 is what it covers, and we've entitled this lesson Thrive. I want to ask you a question. Have you ever noticed a connection between someone's lifestyle and their countenance? You probably have. I know that can seem like a politically incorrect kind of question, but we've all seen people that maybe they were addicted to some kind of substance, and you could just see that they wore it on their face almost. We all are affected physically by our choices. Any reasonable person would agree that the choices we make to affect our bodies, and this is true in a negative and in a positive way. There's also a lot of good choices that we can make that can affect us in a positive way. God has given mankind the gift of agency. We have a free will to make choices, and so much of Proverbs is given to making choices and making wise and right choices. It's largely concerned with that. It tells us that we can have a life that's full of wisdom, and when we make wise choices around what God has designed, around the way God's designed the world and how He desires to work, the probability is that we will thrive. When we go against what God wants us to do, against the way He's designed the world, that can lead to a lot of death. In today's text, we are told how to thrive, essentially. We are told which choices we can make so that our lives and eternities can be characterized by flourishing. And so here's the big idea of today's lesson. Believers can thrive when they choose wisely, considering these four contrasts. Now, most of what we have learned so far from the book of Proverbs, the format of the lessons have been basically a dialogue, a father, not really a dialogue, a monologue, a father teaching his son, hey, this is the choices that you need to make. And so therefore, each verse is connected to the next. There's a flow of thought. And this is true the first chapters in Proverbs. There's a flow of thought, there's a theme, that kind of a thing. Well, there's a theme to today's lesson too, but it's not a one verse after the other kind of flow. Today's text that we're going to study here in Proverbs chapter, what is it, number 16? Number 14, uses a thing called chiastic structure. And a chiasm is basically defined as a literary technique in narrative motifs and other textual passages. An example of chiastic structure would be two ideas, A1 and B1, together with variants A2 and B2 being presented as A1, B1, B2, and A2. Let me give you an example from the New Testament. Here in Matthew chapter 7, verse 6, this is Jesus speaking, and He says, "Give not that which is holy unto the dogs, neither cast ye your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet, and turn again and rend you." So you have kind of two different animals and two different actions that the animals are doing in this verse. First, you have dogs. Jesus says, "Don't give what is holy unto the dogs." And then later on He says, "And turn again and rend you." So what's doing the rending is the dogs. He says, "Neither cast your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under feet." Well, the swine are the one trampling them under feet. I guess technically dogs could trample, but obviously that's more of the idea is that the swine is what's trampling and the dogs are what's rending. So the first part corresponds to the last part. A1 corresponds to A2, and B1 corresponds to B2. Well, when you look at this week's text, and this may be hard to see on the video, it does kind of the same thing, but it's a lot more complex. You have verse 8 corresponding with verse 15, verse 9 with verse 14, verse 10 with verse 13, and then verses 11 and 12 being the midpoint of the chiasm. Chiasm is another way of saying chiastic structure. This is a chiasm. Usually, typically, when someone wrote this way, what they were trying to emphasize is in the middle, the most innermost part of the chiasm. Here it's D1 and D2. There are people, once you start seeing these, you'll see them all over the Bible. In fact, I've said it before several times that there are some people that even submit that Luke and Acts, which are two parts of one work, the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, that the whole book is written in a chiastic structure, going from Galilee to Samaria to Jerusalem, and then the middle of it being Acts 1:8. You shall be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and unto the uttermost parts of the earth. And then the structure of Acts is they're there in Jerusalem, then they go to Judea, Samaria, and then the rest of the book is about the uttermost parts of the earth. And so there's some that, talk about the chiasm of that particular passage. But anyway, this is the structure that's written. And so as we go through these four contrasts that show us that we can thrive, you'll see that we've connected each of these contrasts. A1 and A2 is one contrast, B1 and B2 is another, C1 and C2 is another, and D1 and D2 are the last contrast. All these having to deal with what does it look like to flourish. And the big idea why we're talking about thriving is because what's emphasized here in the middle, D1, comes from verse 11. The house of wicked shall be overthrown, but the tabernacle of the upright shall flourish. And this is the big idea. There's a way that seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. If you want to flourish, do it God's way. If you want to have a life that ends in the ways of death, or are categorized by the ways of death, then do it that way. You can do it your own way. And so that's the idea. So what are the contrasts? Let's look at them. There are four contrasts that lead to flourishing. We can thrive by choosing wisely when we consider four contrasts. Contrast number one, prudence and naivete. The prudent and the naive are basically the contrast. It says, the wisdom of the prudent is to understand his way, but the folly of fools is deceit. The idea here is that a prudent person thinks about his way. He thinks about his life and the choices that he makes and what he wants to do. The folly of fools is deceit. That means they lie to themselves, they are lied to, and being foolish, they believe lies. Look at verse 15. The simple believeth every word. So do you understand? The folly of fools is deceit. They're easily deceived because they believe everything they're told. They believe the wrong, other evil people that teach them the wrong way. So you can see how these two verses are connected, can't you? The folly of fools is deceit. The simple believe every word. They're easily lied to, they're just naive. It says, but the prudent man looketh well to his going. The wisdom of the prudent is to understand his way. He looketh well to his going. A wise person thinks about the decisions they make. They look well to him. They pray to God. They look for people who are thriving in particular areas and get solid wisdom and advice from those people. They don't listen to their broke brother-in-law about money advice. They don't listen to people that have been divorced 5 times about how to do marriage. They're not naive like that. They look for people who are doing it the right way, doing it God's way, and they get wisdom and instruction from them. And they look to God's word primarily to find out what does God say about what needs to happen. And so we can make a choice. We make a choice every day. Are we going to be the prudent person who is careful who we ask, is careful who we get information from, and who thinks about how we're doing life? Or are we the foolish person that just lets anything and everything come into our minds and hearts and believes everything that you're ever told? That's the first contrast. Here's contrast number 2. Contentedness and selfishness. Contentedness and selfishness. Let's look at verse 9. It says, fools make a mock at sin, but among the righteous there is favor. The backslider in heart shall be filled with his own ways, and a good man shall be satisfied from himself. So you have kind of this contrasting idea here. The selfish person is the person that makes a mock of sin. This means that the fool takes sin lightly. They don't view sin as a grave offense against God, and may not even see it as a category in heart at all. So you have the fool up here. Down here you have the backslider in heart that's filled with his own way. The phrase backslider in heart is used in the Old Testament to speak of someone who ignores or disbelieves God. They're filled with their own way. This means they're discontented with God's way and full of their own way. And it says, so the end of it is that this backslider heart shall be filled with his own ways. He wants what he wants. They want what they want. They're filled with themselves. They are selfish and obsessed with themselves. But this also means that they will be, when it says being filled with his own ways, that means they're going to be full up with the consequences of their own actions. Right? They're going to be overwhelmed by that. In contrast, the satisfied person is the righteous who find favor with God because their attitude and interaction with sin. The result in verse 14 is a satisfaction of the best kind. It says, and a good man shall be satisfied from himself, meaning that by doing the right thing, they'll get favorable and right rewards, and they'll be satisfied with what happens. Meaning if you work hard and you save your money and you do well with your money, then you'll have money to be able to live and to do right and that kind of thing. This is a generalization. This is an example. But the idea is then you'll be satisfied with what you have. They are contented with the natural result of living according to God's way and reaping those blessings. So what kind of a person are you? Are you someone who is selfish? Are you satisfied? Are you contented, or are you selfish? So that's the second contrast. Here's the third one. The contrast between the inside and the outside. Both of these verses, verse 10 and verse 10 and 13, both of these verses speak about the heart of a person, the inner man, and make some interesting points. The heart knoweth his own bitterness, and a stranger does not intermeddle with his joy. Even in laughter, the heart is sorrowful, and the end of that mirth is heaviness. There's in verse 10 a privacy of the heart. Okay, the author indicates that there are some emotions that are felt so deeply, like bitterness and joy, that they can only be fully accessed and fully felt by the individual that's dealing with them. No matter how clearly you speak, no matter how passionately you share what you feel, there's a part that cannot be fully felt by another person. It's difficult to express on the outside what's being experienced on the inside. And then you have the sorrow of heart in verse 13. It says, even in laughter, the heart is sorrowful, and the end of that mirth is heaviness. We must take verse 13 as a possibility and even a probability, and not necessarily as universally true. The idea that laughter and mirth are not always an indicator. The idea is that laughter and mirth are not always an indicator that everything is okay. There have been times where you see people on the outside and they look like they're laughing, they look like they have a good time, they're well dressed, they look like they're having fun, but the outside doesn't indicate always what's going on completely on the inside. As in verse 10, there's a possibility that someone's expressed feelings or demeanor do not disclose the totality of their emotional or intellectual state. Again, this is particularly true with joy and sorrow. The implications of these truths are profound. We're called to minister as believers, and we're told to feel something with other people. Romans 12:15 says, rejoice with them that do rejoice and weep with them that weep. So here's some implications that we have to recognize with this. We have to recognize the uniqueness of a person's grief or joy. Even though I may have been through something similar to what someone's going through, I have not been exactly through what they're going through. And for me to say that I absolutely know how they feel, you got to be careful using that kind of language, because this verse is saying the wise person understands that there's a part of what you're experiencing that nobody else can feel or understand. We can sympathize with people's pain, but we cannot know exactly what they're thinking and how they're feeling. But so that's one implication. We also need to recognize that we can assume wrongly about another person's emotional and spiritual health. We see people on the outside, they look like they're doing good, but we don't know what's going on the inside. The only person that can perfectly know our hearts is God, is Jesus Christ. And so we have to be careful about that. So in dealing with the heart, we need to be very, very careful. There's another contrast that we need to understand. We want to go with God's way. And in dealing with our hearts, we need to make sure that, yes, we go to other people, but ultimately that we go to God with our lives. There's a thriving that happens when I depend on God with matters of the heart. This is a big deal. Here's the last one. The last contrast is contrast number 4, life and death. Life and death. And this is found in verse 11 and 12. We've kind of already gone over this a little bit, but here's what it says. The house of the wicked shall be overthrown. The house of the wicked shall be overthrown. This is huge. But the tabernacle of the upright shall flourish. So you have this picture of a house whose doors and hinges are the doors are off their hinges. Everything valuable in the house has been broken or taken. There are holes in the roof and nature is coming through. The yard is overgrown and taking over the concrete. So that's the picture you have in 1. The wicked's house is overthrown. It's just a mess. But the tabernacle of the upright shall flourish. I think it's interesting, and I'm just now noticing this as I think about it, that a house is a more permanent structure. A tabernacle is being usually a tent is more temporary. A righteous person understands that this world is not their home, right? It's temporary. But there's a flourishing in this tabernacle when we give our hearts and lives to God by first of all, accepting Him and getting His forgiveness, but then living an upright life, living according to God's ways and not man's ways. The one who lives in man's ways that totally invests in this earth, but ultimately it will be overthrown. Even if their house looks great, eventually this world is there's going to be a new heaven and new earth. This earth is going to pass away, right? So the house of the wicked shall be overthrown. But even in a similar principle here, when you do the wrong thing, wrong ends come. It says in verse 12, there's a way which seemeth right unto a man. Man, if I don't consider God's ways, I just consider my ways. There's a way, there's a kind of living that just seems right to me. It says, but the ends thereof are the ways of death. This doesn't just mean that people die because they make wrong choices. It means that their life is categorized not by flourishing, but by death when they live according to their own way. I believe it was Moses who pleaded with his people in the wilderness over this very issue. In Deuteronomy 30, 19 through 20, he says, I call on heaven and earth to record this day against you that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life, that both thou and thy seed may live, that thou mayest love the Lord thy God, and that thou mayest obey his voice, and that thou mayest cleave unto him, for he is thy life, and the length of thy days, that thou mayest dwell in the land which the Lord sware unto the fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give them. I think that it's so important for us to bring the gospel into our lessons. The gospel is all throughout this, but to make it clear. And the way that seems right to a man is that, good people go to a good place when they die. The truth of the matter is, according to God, there's no good people. We all stand guilty before God. We have to repent and believe the gospel so that God can come and live inside of us. And from the inside out, he can change our hearts so that the way that we live would be characterized not by the ways of death, but by flourishing. I hope this has been helpful to you. Once you get this key of the chiastic structure, you'll get an understanding of the passage. Hey, have a great week, and we'll pray.